courage to use military force against Ukraine. Now we need to think what to do and what to expect next. What are the main conclusions from the current Russia's crisis? How efficient was the deterrence strategy of the West? How to avoid a scenario according to which rescued Ukraine may, however, find itself anchored in a gray zone between Russia and the West without a real perspective of joining NATO and the European Union. We will discuss these questions, these and other questions with our distinguished guests, and I'm happy and proud to present our distinguished speakers. First of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Christoph Heusgen, a well-known German diplomat and the chairman-elect of the Munich Security Forum, the world's leading forum for international security policy. Ambassador Heusgen served as the permanent representative of Germany to the United Nations, and he was the long-time foreign policy advisor to Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2005 and 17. Dr. Fiona Hill, a well-known American diplomat and international affairs expert. Dr. Hill served as Deputy Assistant to the United States President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs at the US National Security Council. Now she is a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Radosław Sikorski, a famous Polish diplomat and politician. He served for many years as the Foreign Minister of Poland. Now, Mr. Sikorski is the member of the European Parliament. And Arseniy Yatsenyuk, chairman of the KSF Security Forum and former Prime Minister of Ukraine. I'm happy that you are all with us, and let's start. And I will start from Arseniy. Mr. Yatsenyuk, how do you see the big picture? How do you assess the actions of the West and Ukraine? What are your main conclusions from this crisis? You're welcome.
First, let me send a very clear-cut message to our friends and our allies and partners. Ukraine was, is, and will be independent and strong and prosperous state. I am very grateful to our European and American friends. And in your person, Ambassador Heusgen, let me thank you to the German people and to the German government for your support. In your person, Dr. Fiona Hill, let me thank you for the United States of America for your unwavering support of Ukraine. And in your person, Minister Sikorski, let me thank you, the entire European Union and Poland for unwavering and strong support of the Ukrainian people. And every single of you made the very strong commands supporting and actually fighting for Ukraine. You know, my guess, what Danylo, you just asked me, I believe that what happened right now is one of the biggest peacekeeping operations of this century, a novel peacekeeping operation. It never happened before, when the US was a flagship that united all allies and partners in the European Union and in NATO, and actually prevented an escalation and prevented the war that was orchestrated, organized, and ready to go by President Putin. Putin didn't expect this kind of response. He didn't expect that the West will be so united, that the West will close its ranks, that the West will underpin and support Ukraine, that the West will make any concessions except fighting for Ukraine, shipping lethal weapon, ready to impose sanctions, very vocal and strong in their unity. But the situation, in my opinion, is far from being over. That's not resolved yet. It's crystal clear that Putin will try to launch a new sophisticated covert or overt operation against Ukraine and the West. He didn't get what he expected for, because his initial idea was either to attack Ukraine or to intimidate Ukraine and the West in order to get not just concessions, in order to get capitulations out of the West and Ukraine. That's what he didn't receive, and he will never receive this. What is important for all of us is to realize that the West and Ukraine, we need all to craft a new contingency plan, because Putin will push further. And in this contingency plan, it's important to realize that his ultimate goal is to take over Ukraine. His ultimate goal is to undermine the West. His ultimate goal is to press on the West in order to get any kind of concessions from the West. We have to stand our ground. NATO perspective for Ukraine is crucial. We do understand that this is the solution that has to be made not in the short run, but in medium or long run. But before this, we need to integrate Ukraine more into the NATO structure to make Ukrainian military more durable. In terms of Minsk deal, it's important to realize that Putin's interpretation of the Minsk deal is similar to capitulation of Ukraine. So we have to insist only on our joint reading of the Minsk deal, which is that Russia is to withdraw from Ukraine, which is Ukraine to take over the control of the Ukrainian border. Ukrainian government has to take over the control of Donetsk and Lugansk, and only afterwards Ukraine will hold free, really free, and really open elections. So once again, we have to stay united, and we need to draw the lessons out of the past. And it seems that this crisis made all us stronger.
I thank you. And now I turn to Ambassador Heusgen. Dear Christoph, some sources told even a concrete date of possible Putin's invasion into Ukraine, which is today, February 16. In your opinion, what has stopped Putin? How do you assess the situation and its further perspectives? You're welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Danylo. It's good to see you, and it's very good to see Prime Minister, to see you, Arseniy, after the very close cooperation we had during very, very critical times, and it's good to see you, Fiona and Radek. I was not convinced that there would be a specific date, but I totally share Arseniy's view that Putin actually, as one of the options that he had, would be to try to conquer all of Ukraine or do the job that he at some stage wanted to do earlier on, you know, the talk about Nova Russia, you know, to try to conquer, you know, the Black Sea coast. They're going from Mariupol to Odessa all the way up to Transnistria. So I think that he has, on many occasions, had several options and was just waited for the reaction. And I very much agree with Arseniy that this was, I like the impression about the peacekeeping operations. I must say, I have worked with many US administrations over time. I think that what President Biden did was, for me, maybe the best operation ever done by a US administration, by going out of its way, by trying really to talk to everybody, to talk to all European partners and beyond, by listening, by giving really the impression that we are all in it together. And this was well done, and he achieved it. He achieved this peacekeeping operation. I know that the new German government, and you are very kind, Danylo, with us so far. You didn't mention the N-word so far. I know that we were not easy, but the way that Biden also handled it, and also how the new government then, with some delays, positioned itself, was absolutely fitting into this game plan that what Arseniy called a peacekeeping operation. But you sound very optimistic. I'm not as optimistic. I think if something happens, if you know, Russia fake news, they can fake some you know, news about genocide. You know, Putin talked about genocide in the Donbass in the press conference. So if he fakes something, he could still turn around. But even if we are now over the hill, so to speak, that he will withdraw his troops, and we'll then see what on the diplomatic front we will achieve. I think that we have to be we have to analyze the situation and be clear that you know, it's not over. I don't have much time. I try to really summarize how now, having worked and observed Putin, followed what he has done. He has, I think after 2012, when he came back as president, when he then at that stage faced a lot of demonstrations on the streets, when he saw what happened in the Arab world, over time he saw what happened with the revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, last year in Belarus. He is scared that this, you know, that the people also in his own country are tired of what I call the kind of post-Soviet, you know, oligarchic systems, and that he has trouble back home. So what he has used to be popular is a new nationalism, which played out in Crimea. The annexation, the invasion, Ukraine annexation was very popular. He's up in the polls. He is still scared. He has killed physically all the opposition or poisoned it. He has closed all NGOs. There is no free media anymore. So it's an authoritarian regime. And how do you continue your support in an authoritarian regime? We see this with Xi. We see it now with him. It's nationalism, and therefore I think that he will continue to you know, keep his eyes on your country. So two things. One, I'm with you. I think we have to be very strong in the support of Ukraine. We have to do it militarily. And let's turn around, and I want to make this point also, Danylo. You have to do your homework as well in your country. I think there is still a lot, because you're under siege. You have to spend more efforts in getting your democracy working. I had a young parliamentarian from Western Ukraine in my office the other day, who was in the parliament, and I said, well, why are you not in the parliament? I mean, you belong there. I said, well, you know, if you don't have the money, if you're not supported by an oligarch, you don't get a seat in the Rada. So this is something we have to work on. You have to build your own resilience. You have to fight corruption. It has to be something, a society where the oligarchs don't have a say. You know, I say this as a friend of your country. Putin, of course, is afraid of your success. If you are successful, if your society flourishes, your economy, then he will be afraid that people in Moscow will ask, well, why it's not possible in Moscow? What's happening in Kiev? So we have to support you. You have to do your homework. We are in it together. And again, wonderful, and thanks for having invited me here today.
Christoph, I do thank you very much. And let me say that I agree with you for 100%, especially on our Ukraine's homework. But here, let me add one additional question. Minsk, you are a student of Minsk agreements. You know them perfectly well, and you know how difficult was that process. Yesterday, the Russian Duma launched a process. Formally, they did it, launched a process of the official recognition of their own so-called republics on our territory. De facto, they put an end to the Minsk agreements. They simply killed them. What should we do with these documents? What is your impression?
Well, you know, Putin, someone says, well, this is a free parliament, and you know what the Duma does, I don't have control, and we all bursted out laughing. I think there maybe, this is one of the options he plays with, is to do with Lugansk and Donetsk what he has done with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I see this as a possibility. I would, by the way, and this is not in compliance with Minsk. There are so many, I think also on the international scene, you have to do more in telling people that when Putin says Kiev has not done its homework on Minsk, you have to get the narrative right. You know, I always start when I say about, you know, Ukraine not implementing Minsk, I say, you know, you have to start at the very beginning. I was there in Minsk when we negotiated the timeline for the ceasefire. The Russians didn't stop their aggression in the ceasefire. They went on for 3 days to occupy Debaltseve, and then they never withdrew their heavy weapons. They still until today don't allow the OSCE SMM to do their work. They have not withdrawn their militias. These are all points of Minsk. And therefore, when you are asked and always say, well, we went to the Rada, and they say they just didn't trust the Russians. Therefore, Poroshenko had so many problems then getting the laws adopted, but rightly so, because the Rada members don't trust Russia that if they do it, that actually Russia would leave. So that's my point of it, but you are absolutely clear. By the way, the other thing, what Putin is doing is by handing out passports is also against at least the spirit of Minsk. You know, you cannot say that it will be under Ukraine's sovereignty when you hand out passports. I think we have to make this, and we have to do this homework here. We have to make it crystal clear that it's Russia that is guilty for not implementing Minsk. Back to you.
Thank you, Christoph, and thank you for being with us. And now I turn to Dr. Fiona Hill. Fiona, happy to see you, and thank you for joining us. In your view, what was the real purpose of President Putin when he started a new standoff with Ukraine and the West? How do you read his calculus? And what did he gain after all, if any? You're welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Danylo. It's wonderful to be with everyone. And I think, you know, we've already fleshed out clearly already in the discussion what Putin and the Kremlin's calculus was. They fully anticipated that deploying their military forces in such, you know, huge numbers and in such unprecedented formations as well for exercises, that they would intimidate not just Ukraine, but also NATO and Europe, and that there would be, as you already said, some kind of capitulation. And, you know, instead, they've had a different kind of reaction, one that I think, you know, reasonably from Putin's perspective, with the information that they've already had about all of the fractures and the factional fighting, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe and, you know, in the United States as well, they fully anticipated, and again, reasonable to anticipate, that we would fight with ourselves about all of this, and that we would be debating, you know, how to solve it, probably at the expense of Ukraine, not how to push back against Russia. And that was clearly a miscalculation. So what has Putin got out of it so far is exactly as we've said, has been a pretty robust, unprecedented response from not just the United States, but from Western allies and partners of Ukraine writ large. And also a much larger focus on this internationally. For my own part, over you know, the last several weeks, I've had a lot of conversations, not just with European officials, but also officials from other countries. You know, places like India, Korea, Japan, for example, we're all watching this and realizing that any kind of attack and pressure of this kind on Ukraine will have reverberations on a global scale. We've also seen, of course, President Putin on the margins of the Olympics in Beijing have a meeting with President Xi of China to, in some respects, get his endorsement of the kind of pressure that he's going to put on Ukraine, although notably, he doesn't necessarily have the endorsement of an invasion of Ukraine. I think that is also very significant, because Ukraine has its own relationships with China and with other countries that I think, you know, Ukraine will have to pay attention to too, as you do your homework, not just internally, as Christoph has said, but also thinking about Ukraine's international global relationships outside of the European arena is going to be very important too. Because the precedent that Putin is trying to set, not just with the idea of invasion, but with this constant pressure of putting Ukraine under siege, is something that other countries could pick up on. And there are many similar disputes around the world where the independent sovereignty and territorial integrity of critical countries is at threat that could be greatly affected by this. And also, and as we've discussed, what Putin has made very clear now, and the Kremlin has made very clear, that it was never just about Donbass. And if it was back in earlier periods in 2014 and 2015, when the second Minsk agreement was hardly agreed on, but was forced on, as Christoph is outlining, 5, 6, 7 years later, we now see very clearly from the demands that Russia put forward in December of last year, that it's all of Ukraine that is under Russian demands, NATO and the European security arrangements, and also the position of the United States within Europe. And so anything that we thought of before that might be resolved by making Minsk work, as Christoph has said, which was difficult in the first instance, given the lack of trust in what Russia has done, is now under a much greater question mark, because it's clear that that's not sufficient from what Putin wants. So as we've said, Ukraine is in a state of siege now. I mean, like Christoph, I was also not entirely sure that Putin had an intent of going in today or any other specific date, but he's already deployed the full force of the Russian military to very good effect. It's not cost-free to move thousands of men, including from the Russian Far East, where he did need to have an undertaking that China wasn't going to do anything, to the borders of Ukraine. He's clearly changed the whole dynamic in your neighboring country of Belarus, not to good effect. And we also see a real effort to consolidate Russia's position with the deployment of the CSTO in Kazakhstan and other pressure on Armenia and other countries through the earlier war in Nagorno-Karabakh to really change Russia's perspective in the whole of the former Soviet space. So we can see now as we look forward that there will be no relenting of this kind of pressure. And I think, as Christoph has said here, what we're going to have to do is to really prepare ourselves for a much longer set of circumstances. Putin has given himself many options. He's not perhaps got the response that he thought he would. But now it's also incumbent upon all of us internationally, not just within the European space, to maintain our stance. And that's going to be very difficult. And as Christoph said, Ukraine mustn't fight among itself either. I mean, you have to be very careful about internal unity, but we also have to work very hard on our external unity as well. And that's really going to be a challenge, because Putin will keep on calculating that as he makes various moves, he will get degrees of operational surprise again, because we've been calling him out and make it very difficult for him to operate in those circumstances. But he will keep at it to see whether we will crack and whether our resolve will change in support of Ukraine.
Thank you, Fiona. Every speaker who has already spoken at our event mentioned that the story is not over. So the story will continue and the whole drama will continue. Annexing Belarus is yet another dramatic consequence of what Putin is doing in this part of Europe. So, and here I have a special question, not a very easy one. Look, if the West abandons the idea of Ukraine's NATO membership, it will, in my opinion, inevitably invite Putin to further actions and attacks. If the West de facto abandons Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and the independent people of Belarus, we should expect new offenses. Don't you find that the West should elaborate a clear-cut, realistic, and inclusive action plan for our part of Europe to limit and finally to contain the appetites of Putin? This is the contingency plan that Arseniy Yatsenyuk mentioned during our talk. What's your take?
I think we absolutely do need that kind of contingency plan and that long-term perspective. There's a recent article in Foreign Affairs by Ambassador Michael McFaul, who all of us know, talking about Helsinki 2.0. Meaning, basically a reconstitution of the Helsinki meetings that were conducted in the 1970s that Russia actually has signed on to in the final act, and that helped to create what we now have today as the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which can really only be the only framework for resolving many of these issues. Now, Russia, of course, has tried to bring down the OSCE on many different occasions, not just in the Ukrainian context, but in other contexts of Minsk groups and other formats that the OSCE has engaged in. So we have to recommit ourselves to that kind of idea and that kind of framework. Christoph Heusgen and colleagues will be presiding over the Munich Security Conference coming up shortly. That's the kind of forum for these kinds of discussions, to start to think about how we frame things over the longer term. We absolutely need to address this.
I do, thank you. And now I turn to Minister Sikorski. Excellency, happy to see you. Thank you that you are with us. And I immediately start with the question, what conclusions do you draw from this current Russia's crisis and its standoff with Ukraine and the West? You're welcome. Please switch on your mic, please. Right. Good. Wonderful.
Good to be with you. Regards, Christoph, Fiona, Arseniy. I'd just like to say, Prime Minister, that we appreciate your courage in doing the brave reforms of the energy market in Ukraine. And I just wish previous leaders of Ukraine had your courage 20, 25 years before, because if Ukraine had reformed at the same pace as some other countries in the region, perhaps we wouldn't be where we are today. And I agree with those who say that Putin feels threatened by Ukraine's success in associating with Europe, in joining Europe's single market. You're now even possibly testing, synchronizing your energy grids and so on. Ukraine is slipping away from his grip. He needs all of Ukraine. His plan A is to have all of Ukraine in his Euro-Asiatic Union, and for him to be the leader of a multinational organization that he can claim is equivalent to the European Union or to China or to the United States. His plan B is to make Ukraine a failed state so that it doesn't become an inspiration for the people of Russia. And then, of course, there are scenarios in between. I think that irrespective of whether he invades or not, and the Wednesday is still not over, I think it's actually midday in Washington, we are living in a different world, because we now have to acknowledge that we have a leader of a major power, permanent member of the UN, nuclear power, whose leader not only lies repeatedly, but threatens us with war. The war may not come, but the threat happened. And this means that the post-Cold War postmodernist nirvana, the illusion that we live in a world of rules where certain things are unthinkable and there's never a military solution, that's over. And that we need to take consequence, even if Putin regards this as another dress rehearsal, because he will not give up. The nature of his regime has changed. Russia now has more political prisoners than the late Soviet Union. And this is not about only Ukraine. This is also about Russia becoming a repressive empire, repressive internally and expansionist externally. And that's something that has implications for all of Europe, not just Ukraine. Let me just mention one thing on which I'm a witness. President Putin keeps returning to the issue, and Minister Lavrov even mentioned it yesterday at his press conference with the Polish minister who's chairman in office of the OSCE. Namely, that there was some kind of military coup armed coup in Kiev in 2014, in which supposedly Poland, Germany, and France took part. Well, I led the delegation. We were there. We helped to get you to sign a deal with Yanukovych as witnesses. And there was no armed coup. Yanukovych said that he would not fulfill the deal, after which the Ukrainian parliament declared the presidency to be vacant, and he escaped and skipped the country. There were there were perhaps encouragements for mob violence, but it didn't happen. And also, we need to unpick his lie about the autonomy that he supposedly demands for Donbass. You know, a month ago, I was in the Dolomites in Italy. It's called South Tyrol by Austria. It's called Alto Adige by Italy. And it was previously fought over very bitterly and bloodily. And there is autonomy there. 3 official languages, tax privileges, local self-government. And I think I'm right in saying that if that's the kind of autonomy President Putin demanded of Ukraine for Donbass, there would be no problem. Indeed, Ukraine has already passed a law that makes it possible. What he actually wants is for Donbass to have a veto power over the geopolitical orientation of the whole country. So he wants his people to have a hold over all of Ukraine. And that's, of course, something that no sovereign government can agree to, because that means he would then prevent Ukraine from even integrating economically with the EU, let alone more ambitious scenarios. I'm impressed with the way that the United States has strategically communicated the facts, and which made the provocations harder, and perhaps, hopefully, has prevented the war. I hope Ukraine appreciates who his friends in need are, who are supplying weapons for Ukraine's self-defense, the anti-tank weapons, the anti-aircraft weapons, and so on. I say that whoever is against arming Ukraine is for war, because I'm afraid it's not city-to-city arrangements that will deter Putin. It's the fear that the cost might be much higher than he originally anticipated. And I just worry that some of our leaders don't have the imagination to appreciate what kind of people we're dealing with, and don't have the tough language of brutal facts to make them realize what the consequences of launching a war in Europe would be. I just hope we stay united here in the European Parliament. I'm speaking to you from Strasbourg. We had good speeches by the President of the Commission, by the President of the Council. We are united on this. But irrespective of what happens, we need a gas union, we need an energy union, we need a defense union worthy of their names as a response to this.
I thank you. I thank you, Mr. Minister, for recalling the dramatic events of the Revolution of Dignity. This is absolutely clear. And the truth is that Russia continues to lie and to use their lies in order to justify their imperialistic approach against Ukraine, and not only against Ukraine, but beyond, against Poland, against Baltic nations, and far beyond into the West. And here, I want to clarify 1 point or 2 points, if I may, that are important for the Ukrainian audience. Many people in Ukraine are afraid that in the end, it would be Ukraine who will pay the price for Russia's new offensive, meaning 2 major threats and challenges. The first challenge is the Minsk agreements, which can simply, I mean, the implementation in the Russian way of the Minsk agreement may simply dismember Ukraine. And the second challenge is the perspective to become a gray zone, security zone between Russia and the West, without any perspective of becoming a real member of the alliance. In your view, what would you think, what do you think, and what would you suggest how to avoid these traps if you address not only Ukraine, but the Western society? How would you explain this to the West? How difficult and dangerous are these threats? You're welcome.
This is me.
Pardon?
Who are you asking?
Radek, you, Minister.
Right.
You're welcome.
Well, on NATO membership, Christoph and I were both at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008 when Ukraine applied for a membership action plan, and we had no consensus on that, and nothing has changed since then. And actually, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't anticipate anything changing on that for many years to come. So this is a completely false argument by President Putin. Legally speaking, Ukraine has not moved an inch towards NATO membership since 2008. What he wants is not security guarantees, he clearly wants Ukraine. And you have, of course, a very difficult judgment to make, whether to try some kind of compromise or whether to face the risk of Putin invading and helping himself to parts of Ukraine again. You know, we in Poland know this story. Russia has partitioned these territories before in the 18th century. And you know, we even joke about it. You know, Russia never invades anybody. Russia always only comes to the assistance of downtrodden minorities, right? And I don't know if you had this anecdote in Ukraine, but we did in Poland during the Cold War. You know, what is a secure border of the Soviet Union? A secure border of the Soviet Union is one that has Soviet soldiers on both sides of it. With whom does the Soviet Union border? With whomever it pleases. And with who does it please? With nobody. This is a very old story. We've seen it all before. And the difference is that this time, Ukraine is actually getting some assistance. And we all have moral clarity about what President Putin is trying to achieve. And I think we are pretty determined not to let him have it.
Good. Mr. Minister, thank you for this. This is a good point about the Soviet-Russian border, and let's do everything possible, including getting Ukraine into NATO and getting our neighbors like Moldova and Georgia into the alliance in order to avoid the possibility that Soviet empire continues to poison and threaten our lives. And here, dear colleagues, as we approach the end of our interesting conversation, I would like to invite each of you to address Ukraine and to send your message to the Ukrainian people who struggle for their independence with dignity and sense of freedom to protect the lives of our nation and our families and our land. Ambassador Heusgen, you are welcome.
Thank you very much, Danylo. I've worked, you know, in support of your country for many years, and it was a privilege to work with then Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk. I have followed the fate of your country. I'm full of admiration for the sense of freedom, sense of dignity that your countrymen and countrywomen have shown. I feel deeply obliged as a German also to continue this support. I read the speech and the history of the place called Babin Jar in the neighborhood of Kiev, where in the name of Germany 80 years ago, during 2 days, more than 30,000 Ukrainian Jews, Jewish Ukrainians were killed. And I feel this obligation today to be at your side. I'm also promoting that Germany should provide defensive weapons to your country. We'll stick with you. You are the defender of democracy, of freedom, and we support you, and we appeal at the same time to you to overcome your internal discrepancies, to overcome internal fighting. It cannot be, to say this, that former President Poroshenko, who was, in my views, a strong patriot, is now facing trial in your country.
I thank you. Fiona Hill.
I also want to pick up on this point of the absolute importance of solidarity on all fronts at this moment and not engaging in infighting. Because, you know, what we've all learned from this time, and, you know, as Radek has pointed out, and the history of Poland and its experience over centuries, as well as Ukraine and all the other lands of the former Russian and Soviet empires show, that Russia will exploit any kind of weakness, any kind of infighting, any kind of corruption, and any events where people are trying to push for their own personal gain and not paying full attention to their responsibilities as citizens and as leaders of countries. The same has happened in the United States. In 2016, when Russia interfered in our election, it was exploiting infighting and partisan politics inside the United States, and has continued to do so. I want to just actually make a personal comment. It's a little bit of a strange one, but I started studying Russian in 1984, in part because of money that came from the miners of the Donbass in support of the miners of my home region of County Durham in the northeast of England. I'm the daughter of a coal miner. And in 1985, the whole of Britain was torn apart by what was the largest industrial action in United Kingdom history since the 1920s in the Great General Strike of 1926. The miners' strike turned the whole place that I grew up on its head. And the miners of Donbass at the time, along with miners throughout what was then the Soviet Union, raised money in solidarity and support for people, for other people. Donbass today is suffering. The people of Donbass are suffering. They're still Ukrainians, and they're still people who identify themselves in different ways. And I remember that act of solidarity. I got some of that money to start my studies. So on a personal level, I feel acutely pained by what I'm seeing happening, by people being exploited by others, their weaknesses, their concerns being exploited. So everyone needs to remember that human beings are at the heart of all of this, and that every case of socio-economic and political and identity problems that people face can be exploited by people from the outside. Solidarity was important then. I benefited from it. Let's all stand in solidarity now. It's essential.
I do thank you. And please be assured that Ukraine remembers your active support in the years when you were the member of the US administration, and we are grateful to your support today. And now, Minister Sikorski, you are welcome.
Well, this is a dramatic moment, but it's also sublime, because it's not just Europe, it's not just Ukraine and Russia that is at a crossroads, it's Europe. We can continue on the road of peaceful coexistence, or we may turn back to the law of the fist, which is no law at all, to the big dictating to the smaller, to the darkest pages of European history that we thought were behind us. And it will be up to Ukraine, its cohesion, its courage, to prevent that bad scenario and to deter, hopefully, President Putin. We have a civilizational conflict inside Europe. There are people who believe in the atavistic values of tribe and glory and rebuilding empires, and there are people who are attached to democratic procedures, to rule of law, to respect for minorities, to rubbing along with one another. And this, where we go might be decided in Ukraine in the next few days. So you have a huge responsibility too. In Poland, we know the word solidarity very well, and we feel it, and we will help you as much as we can. But it's your meeting with history. Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. I thank you, Mr. Minister, and I thank you all for your great remarks. Let me conclude from the perspective of the Kyiv Security Forum, which is led by Arseniy Yatsenyuk. In our view, the main conclusions are very clear. Putin and the Russian idea have lost to today's Ukraine. But Putin is not going to stop. Putin and Russia will try to continue their efforts to anchor Ukraine in this gray zone between Russia and the West. For that, we need to stick together, to move, as it was today stated during our conversation, in solidarity and dignity and mutual respect and support. Under no circumstances should we deviate from the idea of Ukraine's membership in NATO and the European Union. We can't accept Russian ultimatums toward restoring the peace settlement in Eastern Europe. in eastern Ukraine. And neither can we forget about Moldova, Georgia, or the independent people of Belarus. We need a common victory, and it is achievable. Дуже дякую вам. I thank you very much for this great talk. Дякую.